Everyone in the conference room was waiting to see how Jimmy Hoffa would react. The journalist's question was insulting, deliberate, sharp, merciless. People expected anger or perhaps a polite deflection. What they got instead shocked everyone in the room. It happened in March 1964 at the Statler Hotel in Detroit. Jimmy Hoffa was presenting a new collective bargaining agreement as president of the Teamsters Union, and the conference room was packed with more than 60 journalists from around the world. At 51 years old, Jimmy was at a critical point in his career. Some critics had already begun to label him a relic of the past. Robert Kennedy's target, champion of union rights, linked to organized crime. The labels were everywhere. The room buzzed with the familiar energy of a major labor movement event. Cameras clicked. Journalists shuffled their notes. Public relations staff hovered along the walls. Jimmy sat at the central table, calm as ever, flanked by his press, secretary, and the union's vice president. He had been answering questions for nearly 40 minutes when a young man in the third row raised his hand. His name was Richard Whitmore. He was 27 years old and wrote for a progressive news magazine that prided itself on bold journalism. Richard had built a small reputation for asking provocative questions designed less to uncover insight and more to generate headlines. He was ambitious, confident, and moments away from making the biggest mistake of his professional life. The PR representative nodded toward him. Richard stood, lifting his recorder into the air. There was something in his posture, a smug self-assurance that caused a few veteran reporters to exchange knowing glances. They had seen this type before. Young, hungry, eager to topple an icon and make a name for himself. "Mr. Hoffa," Richard began, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Your union's membership numbers may be at record highs, but many workers are increasingly opposed to your methods they see as violent and corrupt." He paused, letting the words settle. "At your age, don't you think it's time to step aside and admit that your old tactics no longer work? Aren't you simply clinging to an outdated model of union bossism that modern workers have already left behind?" The room fell silent. Not the normal pause between question and answer, but a truly uncomfortable silence. A few journalists actually turned in their seats to look at Richard as if trying to confirm whether he had really just said that out loud. The PR representative's professional smile collapsed into barely concealed horror. Jimmy didn't move. He looked directly at Richard with those famous dark brown eyes. His expression was completely neutral. No anger, no surprise. Just a long, steady stare that seemed to stretch on forever. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. The silence became almost unbearable. Richard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His confidence began to crack. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. He had expected a defensive response, or better yet, an angry outburst worthy of a headline. Instead, he was getting nothing but that unshakable gaze. Finally, Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, each word chosen with care. "Son," Jimmy said, "if you have to explain why your question is smart, it probably isn't." That was it. One sentence, 13 words. The room erupted, not with applause or laughter, but with a collective exhale. A few seasoned journalists actually smiled, recognizing a master class in putting someone in their place without raising one's voice. The PR representative's expression shifted to something between relief and amusement, and Richard Whitmore's face went from confident to pale in about 2 seconds. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease, and continued in the same calm tone. I've been fighting for workers since before you were born. I've worked alongside the union leaders and activists you probably studied in college, and over those decades I've learned something important. He paused, not for a dramatic effect, but as if he were genuinely considering his next words. People who talk most about relevance are usually the ones most worried about their own. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. Jimmy had just delivered a lesson in dignity and in how to respond to disrespect without sinking to its level. Richard sat down quickly, his face flushed. He fumbled with his recorder, suddenly eager to disappear. Around him, other journalists avoided eye contact the way people do when someone has been publicly embarrassed. The PR representative seized the moment and immediately pointed to another reporter, pushing the press conference forward. But something in the room had changed. The questions that followed were more thoughtful, more measured. Jimmy had reminded everyone present of the difference between tough questions and cheap ones, between journalism and performance. What happened next unfolded over days and weeks, but it began the moment the press conference ended. As Richard Whitmore left the room, he may have thought he had escaped serious damage. After all, he'd been put in his place. But he had a quote, didn't he? He could still write a provocative piece about Jimmy Hoffa, still present himself as the brave journalist, willing to ask hard questions. That evening he sat in his hotel room, laptop open, trying to write the article. But nothing worked. Every angle felt hollow. Every attempt to spin the exchange in his favor made him look worse. The problem was simple. Jimmy's response was perfect, measured, wise, and Richard's question was exactly what it appeared to be: malicious and shallow. Still, he submitted the piece. 3 days later, it was published under the headline, "An Aging Hoffa Defends His Union Formula." Richard framed it as a story about resistance to change, about old leaders clinging to past glory. But he made a critical mistake. He included the full exchange, Jimmy's response and all. The backlash was swift and brutal. Within hours, social media lit up. Entertainment and media watchdog sites picked up the story, but not in the way Richard had hoped. Headlines read, "Journalist schooled by Jimmy Hoffa and young reporter's cheap shot backfires spectacularly." Other journalists, including several who had been in the room, wrote their own pieces. They spoke about professionalism, about the difference between holding powerful people accountable and being disrespectful for attention. Richard's name became shorthand for what not to do in journalism. 2 days after the article ran, his editor called him. The conversation was short and devastating. The magazine was receiving complaints from public relations firms, fellow journalists, and readers. Several major unions had called to say they would reconsider their relationship with the publication if Richard continued to represent them at events. "You made us look amateur," the editor said. "You made yourself the story instead of reporting it. And worse, you handed Jimmy Hoffa the moral high ground. That's not journalism. That's ego." Richard was pulled from political reporting. 3 weeks later, he was laid off entirely. The official reason was restructuring. Everyone knew the truth. He had become a liability. He tried freelancing, but doors that had once been open were now firmly shut. PR professionals remembered his name. Journalists remembered the incident. In an industry built on trust and relationships, one question and an 18-word response had done irreparable damage to his reputation. The final blow came 6 months later. The Teamsters' new contract delivered historic gains. Membership numbers reached record highs, and Jimmy Hoffa at 51 proved exactly what he had said at that press conference. Relevance isn't about age. It's about substance. Richard Whitmore eventually left journalism altogether. The last anyone heard, he was working in corporate communications, far from the spotlight he once chased. The Wikipedia page he used to update with his articles and achievements now mostly features the embedded video of the Jimmy Hoffa exchange at the top. Meanwhile, Jimmy Hoffa continued fighting for workers' rights. He spent more years in union leadership, secured more victories, and repeatedly proved that skill and mastery do not expire with age. He never publicly referenced the incident again. He didn't need to. The story became a cautionary tale in journalism schools. Professors used it as an example of how not to conduct an interview, of how ego destroys credibility, and of how the best responses to disrespect are often the quietest ones. Students watched the video of the exchange, noting Jimmy's calm demeanor, his measured words, his refusal to take the bait. Journalists who were in the room that day still talk about it. They describe it as a master class in composure, a reminder that true authority doesn't need to shout. One veteran reporter who had covered labor movements for over 40 years put it best: "I've seen union leaders lose their tempers at press conferences. I've seen them storm out. I've seen defensive, rambling answers. What I'd never seen before that day was someone dismantle a provocateur with courtesy and wisdom. Jimmy didn't destroy that kid. He gave him a chance to learn something the kid chose not to." The incident also shaped how other young journalists approached their work. Some took it as a lesson in professionalism. Others saw it as a warning against confusing provocation with courage. The best of them understood that holding powerful people accountable doesn't require disrespect, and that the most effective questions come from genuine curiosity, not a hunger for conflict. For Jimmy Hoffa, it was probably just one press conference among thousands. He had faced tough questions before and would again. But the answer he gave that day became part of his legacy. Another example of the quiet strength that defined both his public presence and his real-life character. If you have to explain why your question is smart, it probably isn't entered journalism's unofficial lexicon. It appeared on T-shirts worn by journalism students. It showed up in articles about interview techniques. It became shorthand for a simple truth: substance matters more than style, and respect matters more than attention. Today, if you search Richard Whitmore's name, the Jimmy Hoffa incident is still the first result. More than 30 years have passed, but the internet doesn't forget. The video of the exchange has millions of views, with commenters dissecting every second. Jimmy's calm response, Richard's visible discomfort, the shift in the room's energy. The lesson from that March day in 1964 isn't complicated. It isn't really about age or relevance or even journalism. It's about character. It's about understanding that how you respond to disrespect says it is more about you than the disrespect itself. It's about realizing that true confidence doesn't need to belittle others to prove its worth. Jimmy Hoffa taught that lesson in 13 words. Richard Whitmore learned it with his career, and everyone in that room, along with millions who later watched the video, witnessed what happens when quiet dignity meets calculated provocation. The question was meant to embarrass an aging union leader. Instead, it revealed the difference between someone who had earned respect through decades of work and someone trying to demand relevance through cheap confrontation. One sentence was enough to make that difference crystal clear.